Montana Territory, 1873. The last light of day streaked across the vast prairie like blood from a fresh wound. In this untamed country where a man lived and died by his own rules, Zachary Holt believed one thing above all else. Trust was a luxury he could not afford. At 25, he had already seen how quickly trust could turn a living man into a dead one. Zach adjusted his Stetson against the setting sun, squinting at the distant outline of Timber Creek. The small settlement represented another temporary stop, another place to earn enough money before moving on. 6 years of drifting had taught him that attachments were dangerous. Friends became targets, lovers became leverage. The only safe path was the solitary one. His bay gelding shifted beneath him, sensing his tension. Zach patted the horse's neck, the only living creature he allowed himself to care about. "Just you and me, Thunder," he murmured. "We will be gone before anyone learns our names." The deep pink scar running from his collarbone to his shoulder blade seemed to tingle in agreement, a permanent reminder of what happened when you let people get close. His handsome face, still youthful despite the hardened look in his blue eyes, remained impassive as he urged Thunder toward town. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist, Zach cut an impressive figure. His light brown hair curled slightly under his hat and 3 days of stubble shadowed his strong jawline. Women noticed him. He made sure they never got close enough to matter. As Timber Creek's buildings came into view, Zach reminded himself of the plan: 2 weeks of work at the Rocking M Ranch, then move on before winter. No friendships, no entanglements, no exceptions. The frontier had no place for love. Only survival. Little did Zach know that fate had set different plans in motion, plans that began with a stagecoach scheduled to arrive the very next day. When the morning stage rolled into Timber Creek, it brought with it a cloud of dust, the usual mail packets, and one unexpected passenger. Lillian West stepped down from the coach with careful poise that belied her exhaustion after 3 days of hard travel. At 22, she carried herself with the confidence of someone much older, her emerald green traveling dress dusty but impeccably tailored. Zach wouldn't have noticed her at all if he hadn't been waiting for a package at the general store across the street. But there was something about the way she surveyed the town, cautious yet determined, that caught his attention. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly under a modest hat, though a few stubborn strands had escaped to frame a face that struck him as both beautiful and troubled. What truly captured his notice, however, was the leather satchel she clutched to her side with white-knuckled intensity. "That all your luggage, miss?" asked the stage driver, helping down an older woman behind her. "Yes," Lillian answered. "Thank you." Her voice carried a hint of somewhere east, perhaps Boston or Philadelphia, cultured but not pretentious. Zach told himself to look away. This woman and her mysterious satchel were none of his business. Yet he found himself watching as she made inquiries to the station master, who pointed toward the town's only hotel. "Mr. Holt," the shopkeeper's voice broke his trance. "Sorry," Zach replied, turning back to the counter. "What was that?" "Your package hasn't arrived, maybe next week's stage." Nodding, Zach stepped back onto the boardwalk, just in time to see the woman disappear into the hotel. Something about her struck him as different from the other Eastern ladies who occasionally passed through. There was a wariness in her movements, a vigilance that reminded him of prey being stalked. He recognized it because he'd lived it. Shaking off the unwanted curiosity, Zach headed toward the stables. He had work to do at the Rocking M, and mysterious women with suspicious satchels were exactly the kind of complication he avoided. 2 days later, Zach found himself replacing rotten fence posts when Tom Miller, the ranch foreman, rode up with news. "Boss needs you to escort a lady to the Whitaker place tomorrow," Tom said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Seems she's some kind of teacher or governess for their kids." Zach frowned, driving his shovel into the dirt with unnecessary force. "Why me? Jenkins would be better suited." "Jenkins threw his back out," Tom replied, looking amused at Zach's discomfort. "Besides, you're the only one who isn't needed for the cattle drive preparation." "Fine," Zach muttered. "Where am I meeting her?" "Hotel in town, 8 sharp, her name's Miss West." A flicker of recognition passed through Zach, the woman with the satchel, of course. The next morning found Zach waiting outside the hotel, Thunder saddled alongside a gentle mare for their passenger. The spring air carried a chill that promised to burn off by midday, but for now, it kept Zach alert as he scanned the street with habitual vigilance. The hotel door swung open, and Lillian West emerged in a riding habit of deep blue. Her hair was braided and pinned securely, practical for the journey ahead, and just as before, the leather satchel was clutched firmly in her hand. "Mr. Holt," she asked, approaching him with measured steps. "Miss West," he replied with a nod, removing his hat briefly. "I'll be escorting you to the Whitaker Ranch today." She assessed him with intelligent green eyes. "Have you worked for the Whitakers long?" "I don't, I work for the Rocking M." "This is a favor to Mr. Miller." Something in her posture relaxed slightly at this information. "I see. Well, I appreciate the escort. I understand it's quite a journey." "About 5 hours," Zach confirmed, eyeing the satchel. "I can secure that in your saddlebags if you'd like." Her grip on the leather bag tightened. "No, thank you, I'll keep it with me." Zach raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "As you wish, can you ride?" "Yes," she said, a flicker of pride crossing her features. "Quite well, actually." He helped her mount, noticing how she arranged her riding skirt while never releasing the satchel. Once she was settled, he swung up onto Thunder and led them out of town. For the first hour, they rode in silence, which suited Zach fine. The less he knew about Lillian West, the better. But as the terrain grew rougher and the trail narrowed, he found himself glancing back more frequently to ensure she was managing. To his surprise, she handled herself capably, adjusting her weight with the mare's movements as they navigated a rocky incline. "You said you ride well," he remarked during a brief rest. "You weren't exaggerating." A small smile touched her lips. "My father believed all proper young ladies should ride, though I suspect he taught me because he wanted a riding companion rather than out of any progressive notions about women's education." Zach offered her his canteen. "And yet you're traveling alone to become a governess in Montana territory." She accepted the water, taking a careful sip. "Life rarely unfolds as expected, Mr. Holt." She returned the canteen, still cradling the satchel in her lap. "Sometimes we must adapt to circumstances beyond our control." There was a story there, one that piqued his unwilling curiosity, but before he could respond, a flash of movement in the distance caught his attention. Riders, 3 of them moving fast along the ridge to the north. "We need to move," Zach said, instantly alert. "Now." To her credit, Lillian asked no questions, immediately mounting her horse. Zach led them into a stand of pines, hoping the dense forest would conceal their presence. They rode deeper into the trees, following a game trail barely wide enough for their horses. "Are those men following us?" Lillian finally asked, her voice low but steady. "Not sure," Zach replied honestly, "but 3 riders moving that fast usually means trouble." They continued in tense silence until they reached a small clearing with a stream. Zach dismounted, helping Lillian down. "We'll wait here a while," he said. "Let the horses rest and see if those riders pass by." She nodded, still clutching her satchel close. As they waited, Zach found himself studying her more closely. Despite her obvious fatigue, she maintained an alert posture, her eyes scanning their surroundings with the same wariness he'd noticed in town. "Is someone looking for you, Miss West?" he asked bluntly. Her eyes snapped to his, widening briefly before her expression closed. "Why would you ask such a thing?" "Because you haven't let that satchel out of your sight since you arrived in Timber Creek. Because you look over your shoulder like someone might be gaining on you. Because you didn't seem surprised when I spotted those riders." Color rose in her cheeks. "My personal matters are none of your concern, Mr. Holt." "They are if they put me in danger," he countered. "I've got no interest in your secrets, but I need to know what I'm riding into." For a long moment, she simply stared at him as if weighing his trustworthiness. Finally, she sighed. "I have no reason to believe anyone is following me specifically," she said carefully, "but I would be naive not to exercise caution as a woman traveling alone." It wasn't the whole truth, Zach could see that clearly. But before he could press further, the distant sound of hoofbeats silenced them both. He moved to the edge of the clearing, hand on his revolver, and peered through the trees. The 3 riders passed about 200 yards away, following the main trail. They weren't searching the woods, which suggested they weren't tracking anyone, just travelers in a hurry perhaps. Zach felt the tension ease from his shoulders. They're gone. We should continue if we want to reach the Whittaker place before dark. As they prepared to mount up, Lillian suddenly stumbled. Zach reached out instinctively, catching her arm to steady her. In the process, the satchel slipped from her grasp, landing with a thud that sounded oddly metallic. They both froze. Lillian's face had gone pale. "Are you all right?" Zach asked, releasing her arm. "Yes," she said quickly, bending to retrieve the satchel. Just a moment of dizziness. But as she lifted the bag, Zach noticed how its contents shifted unnaturally. Whatever was inside was heavy and solid. Not clothing or books that a governess might carry. Their eyes met and he saw something new in hers. Fear. "Mr. Holt," she said quietly, "I must ask you something rather unusual." "What's that?" "Promise me you won't ask about this satchel again. And promise you will never, under any circumstances, attempt to open it." Zach stared at her, baffled by the request. "Why would I?" "Please," she interrupted, her voice suddenly intense. "I cannot explain, but I need your word." Every instinct warned Zach against making such a promise. In his experience, secrets got people killed, yet something in her desperate expression moved him unexpectedly. "You have my word," he found himself saying, "but if whatever's in there puts either of us in danger." "It won't," she assured him, relief softening her features. "Not as long as it remains closed and in my possession." They resumed their journey, the mysterious satchel secured in front of Lillian on her saddle. Zach couldn't help wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd promised not to ask about the satchel, but that didn't stop him from speculating. Money, jewelry, some kind of weapon. The wise thing would be to deliver her to the Whittaker ranch and ride away, forgetting about Lillian West and her secrets. Yet as they traveled, he found himself increasingly curious about the woman herself. "How did you come to accept a position so far from civilization?" he asked as they forded a shallow stream. She seemed surprised by the question. "The Whittakers advertised in Boston newspapers. 3 children needing education and proper upbringing. The salary is generous. Most Eastern women would consider Montana Territory a punishment, not an opportunity." A small smile touched her lips. "Perhaps I'm not most Eastern women," after a pause she added, "or perhaps I needed a fresh start." Running from something, the question slipped out before he could stop it. Her smile vanished. "Aren't we all in one way or another?" The perceptiveness of her response unsettled him. Zach fell silent, focusing on the trail ahead. They reached a high meadow where wildflowers had begun to bloom, painting the landscape in vivid purples and yellows. Despite himself, Zach found the view worthy of comment. "Beautiful country," he observed, "different from the east, I imagine." Lillian's expression softened as she took in the vista. "Very different, but beautiful in its own right. There's a honesty to it. The land doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." "Unlike people," Zach remarked. "Yes," she agreed quietly, "unlike people." They stopped for a brief lunch in the shelter of an outcropping. Zach shared jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag, while Lillian contributed an apple she'd brought from town. As they ate, thunder rumbled in the distance. "Storm's coming," Zach noted, eyeing the darkening western sky. "We should hurry. There's an old line shack about an hour ahead if we can't outrun it." They mounted quickly, pushing the horses to a faster pace. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Lillian kept pace admirably, but Zach could see her fatigue growing. When the first fat raindrops began to fall, he knew they wouldn't beat the storm. "This way," he called over the rising wind, veering off the main trail toward a stand of pines. The line shack came into view just as the sky opened up, rain pouring down in sheets that rapidly soaked them both. The small cabin was crude but sound. Zach helped Lillian dismount, then quickly led the horses to a lean-to on the side of the shack. By the time he'd secured them, both he and Lillian were drenched. Inside, the cabin was spare, a single room with a small stove, rough table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot. Zach immediately set about building a fire in the stove while Lillian stood dripping by the door, shivering. "There might be blankets in that trunk," he said, nodding toward a wooden chest beneath the single window. She moved to investigate, still carrying her satchel. Inside the trunk, she found 2 wool blankets and a faded quilt. "Here," she said, offering him one of the blankets. "Use it to dry off," he replied, coaxing flames from the kindling. I'll be fine once the fire's going. Lillian hesitated, then set down her satchel to unfold the blanket. For the first time since they'd met, the bag wasn't in her immediate grasp. She seemed to realize this at the same moment Zach noticed, her eyes darting to the satchel and then to him. I gave my word, he reminded her quietly. Something like shame flickered across her face. I apologize for my suspicion. It's become habitual. The fire caught properly, spreading warmth through the small space. Outside, rain pounded the roof in a steady drumbeat, occasionally punctuated by crashes of thunder. We'll need to stay until it passes, Zach said, removing his sodden coat. Could be a few hours. Lillian nodded, using the blanket to dry her hair. Her usual composure seemed diminished by exhaustion and cold. When she shivered again, Zach frowned. You should get out of those wet clothes, he said practically. I can step outside. In this downpour, don't be ridiculous. She glanced around the one-room cabin. Perhaps you could. Turn your back. Zach nodded and faced the wall. He heard the rustle of fabric as she changed, trying to focus on the sound of rain rather than the knowledge that Lillian West was undressing mere feet away. You can turn around now, she said after a few minutes. She had wrapped herself in the quilt, her wet riding habit draped over one of the chairs near the stove. Her hair, freed from its pins, fell in damp waves past her shoulders. The transformation was striking. Without her formal attire, she looked younger, more vulnerable, more real, and still the satchel sat within arm's reach. Your turn, she said, facing the wall as he had done. Zach quickly stripped off his wet clothes, changing into the spare shirt and trousers he carried in his saddlebags. They were slightly damp but better than what he'd been wearing. Decent, he announced. When Lillian turned back, her cheeks were flushed, whether from the warmth of the fire or embarrassment at their situation, he couldn't tell. They were effectively trapped together until the storm passed, a complication neither had anticipated. Are you hungry? Zach asked, more to break the awkward silence than anything else. A little, she admitted. He retrieved a small package from his saddlebag, beef jerky and dried apples. Not exactly a feast. It's perfect, she said, accepting a portion with genuine gratitude. They ate in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Eventually, Lillian spoke. You said you work for the Rocking M. How long have you been there? Just over a week, Zach replied. It's temporary work. You don't stay in one place long, she observed. It wasn't a question, he shrugged. Never saw the point. Family? None to speak of. You? A shadow passed over her face. My parents are deceased. I have an aunt in Philadelphia, but we're not close. So you came to Montana. So I came to Montana, she echoed, staring into the fire. Thunder crashed overhead, louder than before. Lillian flinched, her hand instinctively reaching for the satchel. It must be very important, Zach said quietly, whatever's in there. She looked up, meeting his gaze. I promised not to ask. And I promise not to ask, she corrected. You made no promises about observations. A small smile tugged at her lips. Quite the lawyer, Mr. Holt. Just good at finding loopholes, he replied with a half-smile of his own. For a moment something passed between them, a shared understanding perhaps or simple recognition of a kindred spirit. Then Lillian's expression grew serious. It is important, she said softly, more than you could know. And dangerous in the wrong hands. Zach nodded, accepting this partial truth without pressing for more. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but the worst seemed to be passing. The thunder grew more distant, the rain less intense. We should be able to continue soon, he said, rising to check on the horses. When he returned, Lillian had dressed again, though her habit was still damp. She had repinned her hair, transforming back into the proper Eastern lady he'd first met. Somehow, Zach found himself missing the more unguarded version he'd glimpsed. The Whitaker place is another 2 hours from here, he said, gathering his things. If we leave now, we'll arrive before dark. Lillian nodded, clutching her satchel once more. Thank you, Mr. Holt, for your help and your discretion. Zach, he said suddenly, my name is Zach. She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her face. Lillian, she offered in return. They rode out as the clouds began to break, sunlight streaming through in golden shafts that set the wet landscape gleaming. Zach found himself watching Lillian more often than was strictly necessary, noting the grace with which she handled her mount, the way the returning sun brought out auburn highlights in her chestnut hair. He reminded himself sternly that his interest was dangerous for both of them. Whatever secrets Lillian West was carrying, they were not his concern. In a few hours he would deliver her to the Whitaker ranch, and that would be the end of it. Yet when they crested the final ridge and the Whitaker homestead came into view in the valley below, Zach felt an unexpected pang of regret. "There it is," he said, pointing to the substantial log house and outbuildings. "Looks like they're doing well for themselves." Lillian studied the homestead with an unreadable expression. "It seems welcoming enough." "The Whitakers are good people from what I hear," Zach offered. "Been here nearly 10 years. Built everything themselves." "You know them." "Only by reputation." They rode down into the valley, following a well-maintained trail that led to the house. As they approached, a man emerged onto the porch, followed by a woman and 3 children. "That's them," Zach said quietly. "Ready." Lillian straightened in her saddle, adjusting her grip on the satchel. "Yes, thank you." Samuel Whitaker was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and kind eyes. His wife, Margaret, was petite with streaks of gray in her dark hair. The children, 2 boys and a girl, watched curiously as Lillian dismounted. "Miss West, welcome to our home," Samuel said warmly. "We're mighty pleased you made it safely." "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker," Lillian replied with perfect poise. "I apologize for our late arrival. The storm delayed us." "No matter, you're here now," Margaret said, stepping forward. "Children, come meet your new governess." The introductions were made: Daniel, age 12, Emma, age 9, and Thomas, age 7. The children were polite if reserved, eyeing Lillian and her satchel with undisguised curiosity. "And thank you, Mr. Holt, for escorting Miss West," Samuel added, turning to Zach. "Will you stay for supper?" Zach shook his head. "Much obliged, but I should get back." "Nonsense," Margaret insisted. "It's nearly dark and you've had a long journey. Stay the night and head back in the morning." Zach hesitated, glancing at Lillian. Something in her expression, relief perhaps, made the decision for him. "All right," he conceded. "Thank you." That evening, after a hearty meal of venison stew and fresh bread, Zach found himself sitting on the Whitaker's porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. The door opened behind him and Lillian stepped out, still carrying her satchel. "Do you ever put that thing down?" Zach asked wryly. "Rarely," she admitted, settling onto the bench beside him. "The children seem sweet." "They do," he agreed. "You'll do well here." "Perhaps." She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to thank you again for today. Not many would have been so understanding about my peculiarities." Zach shrugged. "Everyone's got secrets. Even you." He glanced at her, finding genuine interest in her green eyes. "Especially me." Lillian smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. "Then we're quite a pair, aren't we?" The casual intimacy of her comment caught him off guard. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him with such easy familiarity, even longer since he'd welcomed it. "I suppose we are," he replied, surprised to find he meant it. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear overhead. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely howl echoing across the valley. "Will you really leave tomorrow?" Lillian asked suddenly. "That's the plan." "And go where?" Zach considered the question. "Finish my work at the Rocking M then, I don't know, north maybe." "I hear there's work in the gold fields." "Always moving," she observed, "never staying long enough to put down roots." "Roots can be dangerous things," he said quietly. "They make it harder to leave when trouble comes." "And trouble always comes." There was something sad in her voice. "In my experience." He glanced at the satchel in her lap. "Seems you might understand that better than most." Lillian's fingers tightened around the leather handle. "Yes," she whispered, "I do understand." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally Lillian stood. "I should get some rest," she said. "It's been a long day." Zach nodded. "Good night, Lillian." "Good night, Zach." She paused at the door. "Will you say goodbye before you leave?" "If you'd like." "I would," she said simply, and disappeared inside. Zach remained on the porch long after she'd gone, staring at the stars and wondering why the thought of riding away tomorrow left him feeling so unsettled. Morning came clear and bright. Zach rose early, helping Samuel with chores before breakfast as a way to repay the family's hospitality. When he entered the kitchen, Lillian was already there, helping Margaret prepare the meal. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair braided and pinned in a coronet around her head. The satchel sat on the floor beside her chair. "Morning," Zach greeted, removing his hat as he entered. "Good morning," Lillian replied with a warm smile. "Sleep well." "Well enough," he said, taking the seat Samuel indicated. Breakfast was a lively affair, with the children peppering Lillian with questions about Boston and her journey west. She answered with patience and good humor, occasionally glancing at Zach with a look that suggested she was enjoying herself. After the meal, Zach prepared to leave. Samuel insisted on giving him provisions for the journey back, while Margaret packed a bundle of freshly baked bread. As he saddled Thunder, he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Lillian approaching, satchel in hand. "So you're really leaving," she said, stopping a few feet away. "That was always the plan." Zach tightened Thunder's cinch, avoiding her gaze. "Plans can change." He looked up then, surprised by the directness of her comment. Why would they? Lillian took a deep breath. "The Whittakers mentioned they need help with their spring planting. They're willing to hire another hand for a few weeks." Zach stared at her. "And you suggested me." "I might have mentioned you were looking for work," she admitted. "Samuel said he'd pay fair wages." "Why would you do that?" She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Because I'm not ready to say goodbye yet," she said softly. "Is that so terrible?" Something shifted in Zach's chest, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained for so long. This woman, with her mysterious satchel and direct gaze, had somehow breached his defenses in a single day. "It could be," he said honestly, "for both of us." "Or it could be the start of something better," she countered. "A few weeks, Zach. That's all I'm suggesting." He knew he should refuse, get on his horse and ride away, back to the solitary existence he'd cultivated for his own protection. Yet the thought of leaving, of never seeing Lillian West again, suddenly seemed unbearable. "All right," he found himself saying, "a few weeks." The smile that lit her face was worth the risk, he decided, even if he came to regret it later. The days that followed fell into a pleasant routine. Zach worked alongside Samuel in the fields, preparing the soil for planting. In the evenings, he joined the family for meals, finding himself drawn into their warm circle with surprising ease. The Whittakers were good people, hardworking and honest, treating him like one of their own from the start. And then there was Lillian. She took to her role as governess with natural skill, establishing a schoolroom in a corner of the main room where she taught the children each morning. In the afternoons, she helped Margaret with household tasks, always with the satchel nearby. Zach observed how she kept it close, beside her chair at meals, under her desk while teaching, near her bed at night. The Whittakers seemed to accept this peculiarity without question, though he occasionally caught the children eyeing it with curiosity. A week into his stay, Zach was repairing a fence when Lillian approached, carrying a pitcher of water and a cup. "Margaret thought you might be thirsty," she said, pouring a cupful and offering it to him. "Thank you." He drank deeply, grateful for the cool relief. "How are the lessons going?" "Well, I think. Emma has a natural gift for mathematics and Daniel is a voracious reader. Thomas," she smiled fondly, "Thomas would rather be out here with you and Samuel than studying his letters." "Can't blame the boy for that," Zach said, returning her smile. She settled on a nearby stump, arranging her skirts neatly. The satchel, as always, sat beside her. "You've been avoiding me," she observed. Zach blinked at her directness. "I've been working. Even at supper, you barely speak to me." He sighed, setting down his hammer. "Lillian. Are you planning to leave soon?" she asked, an edge of vulnerability in her voice. "I don't know," he admitted. The truth was, he'd been asking himself the same question daily. The longer he stayed, the harder it became to maintain the emotional distance he'd cultivated for years, not just with Lillian, but with the entire Whittaker family. "I think you're afraid," she said quietly. "Excuse me." "Afraid of staying, of caring about people," her green eyes held his steadily, "of letting anyone care about you." Zach felt a flare of defensiveness. You don't know anything about me. I know you carry scars that have nothing to do with that mark on your shoulder, she said, gesturing to where his shirt concealed the scar. I know you watch every room like you're mapping escape routes. I know you flinch when the children touch you, even though you're gentle with them. Her perceptiveness was unnerving. And what about you? He countered. Always clutching that satchel like it contains your very soul, jumping at every unexpected sound, looking over your shoulder when riders pass on the road. We recognize in others what we know in ourselves, Lillian said softly. That's why I trusted you from the start, despite my better judgment. The admission hung between them, honest and raw. Zach found himself at a loss for words, caught between the urge to retreat and the pull to move closer to this woman who saw him so clearly. Before he could respond, Samuel's voice called from the barn, asking for help with a balking horse. Zach seized the interruption with relief. I should go, he said, gathering his tools. Lillian nodded, rising from the stump. Of course, she hesitated, then added, but this conversation isn't finished, Zach. He watched her walk back to the house, the satchel swinging gently at her side, and knew she was right. Whatever was growing between them couldn't be ignored forever. That night, Zach couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot in the small room off the barn that served as his quarters, replaying his conversation with Lillian. Her words had struck too close to home, exposing vulnerabilities he'd spent years burying. The sound of the door creaking open brought him instantly alert. He reached for the revolver beside his bed, then relaxed when he recognized Lillian's silhouette in the doorway. It's late, he said, sitting up. Is something wrong? She closed the door softly behind her, clutching her familiar satchel. In the dim light filtering through the window, her face was shadowed, but he could see she was troubled. I couldn't sleep, she said, remaining by the door. I kept thinking about what I said to you today. It was presumptuous. Zach sighed, running a hand through his hair. It wasn't untrue. Lillian moved closer, perching tentatively on the edge of his cot. Still, I had no right to make such observations, especially when I've been less than forthcoming myself. The proximity of her in the small room, dressed in a simple nightgown with a shawl around her shoulders, her hair loose down her back, created an intimacy that made Zach's heart race. He shifted, maintaining a respectful distance. Lillian, why are you here? He asked gently. She stared down at the satchel in her lap. Because I'm tired of secrets coming between us, she whispered. Because I think I'm falling in love with you, Zachary Holt. And that terrifies me. The confession stunned him into silence. Love was not something he'd allowed himself to consider, not for many years, yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward this brave, enigmatic woman. You don't even know me, he finally managed. I know enough, she countered. I know you're honorable and kind despite your efforts to appear otherwise. I know you're gentle with children and animals. I know you wake before dawn every day to help a family that isn't yours, expecting nothing in return. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing his. And I think you might feel something for me too. Am I wrong? Zach stared at their hands, his larger one gradually turning to entwine with hers. No, he admitted, the word barely audible, you're not wrong. Relief softened her features. Then perhaps it's time I trusted you with my secret. She lifted the satchel from her lap. This is why I came to Montana, why I've been running for nearly 6 months. Zach tensed. Lillian, you don't have to. I want to, she interrupted. I need to. With trembling hands, she unfastened the satchel's buckles and opened it just enough to reach inside. What she withdrew made Zach's breath catch, a small leather-bound journal and a stack of papers tied with string. This journal belonged to my father, she explained, her voice steady despite her obvious tension. He was an accountant for Cornwall Shipping in Boston. 6 months ago, he discovered that the company's owner, Richard Cornwall, was using his ships to smuggle opium into the country. She untied the papers, revealing columns of numbers and dates. Father kept detailed records of the shipments, the bribes to customs officials, everything. He believed in doing what was right, so he prepared to take this evidence to the authorities. Let me guess, Zach said grimly. Cornwall found out. Lillian nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. The night before he planned to go to the federal marshal, men came to our home. I was upstairs when I heard the shouting. By the time I came down, she faltered, grief shadowing her features. They killed him, Zach, shot him in our own parlor. Mother died of a heart attack upon finding his body. Zach's hand tightened around hers. I'm so sorry, Lillian. She drew a shaky breath. I knew about the evidence. Father had told me what he'd discovered, so I took the journal and papers from his study and ran. I've been running ever since. Cornwall's been looking for you, Zach realized. His men have. They've followed me from Boston to Philadelphia to St. Louis. Her green eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I came to Montana because it was the farthest place I could think to go. I'd seen the Whitacres' advertisement and thought a remote ranch might be the perfect hiding place. Zach glanced at the papers, understanding now why she guarded them so fiercely. This is evidence of crimes that could destroy a powerful man. Yes, she confirmed, and the only justice my father will ever receive. Why not mail them to the authorities? Why carry them with you, putting yourself at risk? Lillian's expression hardened. Because Cornwall has connections everywhere. I tried sending copies from Philadelphia, nothing came of it. The next day, men were asking about me at my boarding house. She gently touched the journal. Besides, this is my father's voice. His final testimony. I couldn't bear to part with it until I know justice will be done. The pieces fell into place, her vigilance, her wariness around strangers, her insistence on keeping the satchel close. Zach felt a surge of protectiveness, followed by a colder realization. The men we saw on the trail that day, he said slowly, you think they might have been looking for you. I don't know, she admitted. But I couldn't take the chance. Zach rose, pacing the small room as he processed everything she'd told him. Cornwall Shipping was no small operation. Its owner wielded considerable influence and wealth. If he'd gone so far as to commit murder to protect his smuggling operation, he wouldn't hesitate to pursue Lillian to the ends of the earth. You can't keep running forever, he said finally. I know, she carefully returned the documents to the satchel, but I don't know what else to do. I have no one left to trust. Zach stopped pacing, turning to face her. You have me, he said quietly. If you want. Lillian looked up, hope and caution warring in her expression. What are you saying? He knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. I'm saying I won't let you face this alone anymore. We'll figure out a way to get your evidence to someone who can use it, someone beyond Cornwall's reach. Why would you risk yourself for me, she whispered, for my fight? Because you were right, Zach said, the admission easier than he expected. I have been afraid of caring, of connections, of anything that could be used against me, but meeting you, he shook his head, searching for words. You make me want to stop running too. Tears welled in Lillian's eyes. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I never expected to find someone like you here. Nor I you, he admitted, the moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then with a gentleness that surprised even him, Zach leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. When Lillian responded, her arms slipping around his neck, it deepened into something more profound, a promise, a beginning. When they finally parted, Zach rested his forehead against hers. We should get some rest, he murmured. Tomorrow we start planning. Lillian nodded, reluctantly rising from the cot. Thank you for listening. For believing me. Thank you for trusting me, he replied, walking her to the door. Good night, Lillian. Good night, she whispered, disappearing into the darkness. Zach closed the door, leaning against it with a mixture of exhilaration and trepidation. After years of avoiding attachments, he just committed himself to a dangerous cause and an even more dangerous emotion. Yet for the first time in a very long time, he felt no urge to run. The following week passed in a blur of activity. By day, Zach continued working alongside Samuel, helping prepare the fields for planting. Lillian maintained her role as governess, establishing a routine with the children that brought structure to their education. But in the evenings, after the Whitaker family retired, Zach and Lillian would meet in the barn or by the creek, planning and, increasingly, sharing pieces of themselves they'd kept hidden from others. Zach told her about his parents, killed in a range war when he was 17. About the years that followed, working as a hired hand and occasional bounty hunter, moving constantly to avoid the enemies he'd made. About the knife fight that had left him with the scar on his shoulder and a deep distrust of anyone who got too close. Lillian shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her father's quiet integrity, her mother's love of music. She spoke of her dreams before tragedy struck of teaching in a proper school, perhaps even a women's college someday. "I still want that," she admitted one evening as they sat by the creek. "When this is over, if it's ever over, I want to build something permanent, a life of meaning." "You will," Zach assured her. "We'll make sure of it." The "we" slipped out naturally, though neither commented on its implication. Their relationship existed in a fragile space between present danger and future hopes, tentative yet intensifying with each passing day. After much discussion, they formulated a plan. The territorial marshal in Helena might be beyond Cornwall's influence. If Zach could deliver the evidence personally, explaining the circumstances of Simon West's murder, there might be a chance for justice. "I should be the one to go," Lillian argued when Zach proposed the journey. "They're my father's papers, my testimony would carry more weight." "It's too dangerous," Zach countered. "If Cornwall's men are watching the larger settlements, you'd be recognized immediately." "And you wouldn't," she challenged. "A stranger arriving in Helena with a satchel of evidence would draw attention." She had a point. After several nights of debate, they settled on a compromise. They would travel together to Helena, taking a circuitous route to avoid main roads. Samuel had a cousin there, a lawyer named Joseph Whittaker, who might provide assistance in approaching the marshal. 2 weeks after Lillian's midnight confession, they were ready. Samuel and Margaret, though concerned about the vague explanation of urgent business in Helena, offered their support without pressing for details. Zach promised to return in time for the main planting, while Lillian assured the children she would resume their lessons upon her return. The night before their departure, Zach found Lillian on the porch, gazing at the stars. The satchel, as always, was by her side. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked, settling beside her. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, "though I admit I'm terrified." Zach took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "We'll be careful. 3 days to Helena, a day to meet with the marshal, then back here before anyone realizes where we've gone." Lillian leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you really think it could be that simple?" "No," he admitted honestly, "but I think it's our best chance." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the night sounds of the ranch enveloping them. Finally, Lillian spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever happens in Helena, I want you to know these weeks have been the happiest of my life, despite everything." Zach turned to her, lifting her chin gently. "This isn't goodbye, Lillian. This is just the beginning." Her smile was tremulous. "Promise." "Promise," he said, sealing the vow with a kiss. They left at dawn, following a game trail that would keep them off the main roads until they were well away from Timber Creek. Zach rode Thunder, while Lillian mounted a sturdy mare borrowed from the Whittakers. The satchel, now containing not only Simon West's evidence but also provisions for their journey, was secured to Zach's saddle. The first day passed uneventfully. They made good time, stopping only to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch before continuing. By nightfall, they had reached a small clearing beside a stream, a suitable campsite sheltered by pines. As Zach built a fire, Lillian tended the horses, demonstrating the practical skills that continually surprised him. This woman, raised in Boston society, adapted to frontier life with remarkable resilience. "What?" she asked, catching his admiring gaze as she returned to the fire. "Just thinking how capable you are," he replied honestly. "Most Eastern ladies would be complaining about the lack of proper accommodations by now." Lillian laughed, settling beside him. "I was never much for the vapors and fainting couches. Father always said I had more practicality than propriety." "A compliment, surely." "Not in Boston society," she said wryly, "but out here, perhaps it's served me well." They shared a simple meal of jerky, biscuits, and coffee, planning the next day's route by the firelight. When it came time to sleep, Zach spread his bedroll near the fire, offering Lillian the small tent they'd brought. "You'll be warmer in there," he insisted when she protested, "and you'll catch your death out here," she countered. It's April in Montana, Zach. The nights are still freezing. Before he could argue further, she began dragging her bedroll toward his. We'll share the blankets, she said decisively, for warmth. Zach raised an eyebrow. What would the Whittakers say? They're not here, Lillian pointed out, and I'm a grown woman who can make her own decisions about sleeping arrangements. Her forthright manner made him smile. Yes, ma'am. They lay side by side, a respectful distance between them despite the shared blankets. Above, the stars glittered in a vast canopy, more brilliant away from even the modest lights of the Whittaker ranch. It's beautiful, Lillian murmured, gazing upward. I never saw stars like this in Boston. One advantage of the wilderness, Zach agreed. She turned on her side to face him. Do you think you could ever settle in one place? If you found somewhere that felt like home. The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. Zach considered it carefully, studying her face in the dying firelight. I used to think not, he said finally, but lately. I'm not so sure anymore. Lillian's smile was soft. That sounds like progress. Maybe it is, he reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Get some sleep, Lillian. We have a long ride tomorrow. She nodded, her eyes already growing heavy. Good night, Zach. Good night, he whispered, watching as she drifted to sleep beside him. For a long time after her breathing had deepened into slumber, Zach remained awake, contemplating the woman who had so unexpectedly changed his path. He had meant what he said. For the first time in years, the thought of staying in one place no longer filled him with dread. If that place included Lillian, it might even feel like home. The second day dawned clear and cool. They broke camp efficiently, continuing their journey toward Helena. Zach chose a route that kept them in the foothills, avoiding the more traveled valleys where they might encounter other riders. By midday, they had crossed into rockier terrain, following a narrow path that wound between steep slopes. The horses moved carefully, picking their way over loose stones. Zach rode ahead, occasionally dismounting to check the trail. How much farther to the next water? Lillian asked as they paused in a small clearing. Zach consulted the crude map Samuel had drawn for them. Should be a creek about 2 miles ahead. We can rest the horses there. As they prepared to continue, a sound echoed through the hills, the distant crack of a rifle shot followed by another. Both froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Hunters, maybe, Lillian suggested, though her tense expression belied the casual words. Zach shook his head. Wrong season for big game. He scanned their surroundings, suddenly alert to every movement. Could be nothing, but let's pick up the pace. They mounted quickly, moving faster despite the challenging terrain. Zach led them off the trail they'd been following, choosing instead a more sheltered route through denser trees. His instincts, honed by years of survival on the frontier, hummed with warning. An hour later, they reached the promised creek. Rather than stopping in the open, Zach guided them to a secluded bend where overhanging willows provided cover. Only then did they dismount, leading the horses to drink. You think someone's following us, Lillian said quietly, watching him check his revolver. I think we need to be careful, Zach replied, not wanting to alarm her unnecessarily. Could have been anything we heard. But Lillian wasn't fooled. Cornwall's men. If they traced you to the Whittaker ranch, it's possible. He met her worried gaze. But we've been careful, taken an indirect route. Even if someone is out there, they'd have to know exactly where to look. She nodded, though anxiety remained etched in her features. What do we do? Change plans, Zach decided. There's a small settlement called Riverton about 10 miles east of here, not much more than a trading post and a few cabins, but they have a telegraph. We can wire Helena, ask the marshal to meet us there instead. Is it safe? Safer than continuing through these hills if someone's tracking us, Zach reasoned. More people around, harder for anyone to make a move without witnesses. Lillian considered this, then nodded decisively. Riverton it is. They rested only long enough for the horses to recover before setting out again, now heading east toward the settlement. The terrain gradually opened up, forest giving way to rolling grassland intersected by shallow ravines. As the sun began its descent, Riverton appeared in the distance, a small cluster of buildings beside a river crossing. Zach felt a measure of relief at the sight. They would reach it before dark, find lodging for the night, and send their message to Helena. Then without warning, gunfire erupted from a ravine to their right. Zach reacted instantly, spurring Thunder forward while reaching for Lillian. "Ride!" he shouted, practically dragging her from her saddle onto his horse. The mare bolted at the sound of shots, disappearing into the tall grass. With Lillian clinging to his waist, Zach urged Thunder into a gallop, heading for a stand of cottonwoods that offered the nearest cover. Bullets kicked up dirt around them, too close for comfort. They reached the trees as another volley splintered bark inches from Zach's head. He dismounted quickly, pulling Lillian down and behind the shelter of a thick trunk. "Stay here," he ordered, drawing his revolver. "Zach, no," she protested, clutching his arm. "I need to know who we're dealing with." He gently but firmly removed her hand. "Keep down and don't move." Before she could argue further, he slipped away, moving silently through the trees until he had a view of the ravine where the shots had originated. Squinting against the setting sun, he made out 3 riders emerging from cover, spreading out as they approached the cottonwood grove. Their methodical movements confirmed Zach's fears. These weren't random bandits. They were professionals, likely hired by Cornwall to recover the evidence and silence Lillian permanently. Returning to where he'd left her, Zach found Lillian white-faced but composed. She had retrieved the satchel from Thunder's saddle and now clutched it protectively. 3 men, he reported quietly, well-armed and coming this way. "Cornwall's men," she whispered, certainty in her voice. Zach nodded grimly. "Looks that way." "We're outnumbered and outgunned." He glanced toward Riverton, tantalizingly close yet impossibly far across open ground. "We can't make a run for the settlement. They'd cut us down before we got halfway." Lillian's gaze followed his, calculating. "What about after dark? Could we slip past them then?" "Possibly," Zach admitted, "but they'll have us surrounded by nightfall." She clutched the satchel tighter. "This is what they want if I just—" "No," Zach cut her off sharply. "Don't even think about it. Your father died for what's in that bag. I'm not letting his sacrifice or yours be for nothing." Determination hardened her features. "Then what do we do?" Zach considered their limited options, mind racing. "We need to even the odds," he said finally. "Draw them in, separate them, take them one by one." It was a desperate plan born of necessity rather than confidence, but Lillian nodded, trust evident in her eyes despite the danger. "Tell me what to do," she said simply. As dusk settled over the grove, Zach put his plan into motion. Using Thunder as a decoy, he created a false trail leading north through the trees while he and Lillian remained hidden near the southern edge. As expected, 2 of the pursuers followed the horse's tracks, leaving 1 man to guard the eastern approach toward Riverton. "Now we wait," Zach whispered, crouched beside Lillian in the deepening shadows. They didn't wait long. The lone guard moved cautiously into the grove, rifle ready. Zach tensed as the man passed within yards of their hiding place, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When it came, he moved with practiced efficiency, disarming the man before he could react. A brief, silent struggle ended with their attacker unconscious, bound and gagged with strips torn from his own shirt. "One down," Zach murmured, retrieving the man's weapons. "But the others will be back soon when they realize they're following a false trail." Lillian emerged from hiding, clutching the satchel. In the fading light, her face was pale but resolute. "What now?" "Now we run," Zach said, handing her the captured rifle, "straight for Riverton while we have the chance." They moved swiftly through the gathering darkness, leaving the safety of the trees for the open ground between them and the settlement. Every step exposed, every moment expecting gunfire from behind. They had covered half the distance when shouts erupted from the cottonwood grove. Their escape had been discovered. "Keep moving," Zach urged, taking Lillian's hand as they broke into a run. Shots rang out behind them, but distance and darkness made accuracy impossible. Ahead, lights from Riverton beckoned, growing closer with each labored breath. They reached the outskirts of the settlement as more gunfire peppered the ground around them. A bullet grazed Zach's arm, tearing through his shirt sleeve with a burning sting. He ignored it, pulling Lillian toward the nearest building, a rough-hewn structure with saloon painted in faded letters above its door. They burst inside to the startled faces of a dozen patrons. "Trouble coming," Zach announced, positioning Lillian behind him as he faced the door. "3 armed men on our trail." The saloon fell silent as the gravity of his words registered. Then, to Zach's surprise, several men stood, moving to the windows with rifles and revolvers drawn. "Wouldn't be Cornwall's boys, would it?" asked a grizzled man behind the bar, calmly reaching for a shotgun. Zach exchanged a glance with Lillian, whose expression mirrored his confusion. "You know about Cornwall." The barkeeper spat into a brass spittoon. "Every lawman and bounty hunter from St. Louis to the Rockies knows about Cornwall. There's a federal warrant out for him and his hired guns." He nodded toward a posted notice on the wall, a telegram from the U.S. Marshal's office in Helena. Relief washed over Lillian's face. "Then you know about my father's evidence." "We know there's a reward for anyone helping bring Cornwall to justice," another man said pragmatically, "and a bigger one for anyone who finds the proof of his smuggling operation." Outside, hoofbeats approached. The men in the saloon took positions at windows and doors, weapons ready. "Get the lady to the back room," the barkeeper instructed Zach. "This could get messy." Zach hesitated only briefly before guiding Lillian through a door behind the bar. The small room beyond served as storage for liquor and supplies, with a narrow cot in one corner. "Stay here," he told her, turning back toward the main room. Lillian caught his arm. "Be careful," she whispered, eyes wide with fear for him rather than herself. He touched her cheek gently. "Always am." Returning to the main room, Zach found the saloon had transformed into a fortress. Men had overturned tables for cover, extinguished most of the lamps, and positioned themselves strategically around the room. "Your friends are keeping their distance," the barkeeper informed him. "Circling the building, they know they're outnumbered." "They won't give up easily," Zach warned, "not with what's at stake." "Neither will we," replied a young man by the window, rifle steady in his hands. "Marshall's been after Cornwall for months. We aim to collect that reward." For nearly an hour, the standoff continued. Occasionally, a shadow would move near the edge of visibility, prompting a warning shot from the defenders. But Cornwall's men were professionals. They wouldn't rush into a killing field without a plan. When the attack came, it was not from the front but from above. A bottle crashed through the back window, flames erupting as the makeshift firebomb exploded against the floor. "Fire!" someone shouted as smoke filled the room. Zach's first thought was Lillian. He rushed to the back room, finding her already on her feet, satchel in hand, coughing in the thickening smoke. "They're trying to smoke us out," he explained, leading her toward the main room, but flames now blocked that exit, spreading rapidly across the dry wooden floor. "Back door?" Lillian asked, clutching his hand. "Our only option," Zach agreed grimly, knowing it was likely what their attackers wanted. The rear entrance opened onto a narrow alley between buildings. As they emerged, gasping for fresh air, gunfire erupted from both ends of the passage. Zach pulled Lillian against the wall, returning fire with his revolver while assessing their predicament. They were trapped, with flames at their backs and gunmen blocking both escape routes. "Give us the satchel and the woman lives," called a voice from the darkness. "Last chance, Cowboy." Lillian's fingers dug into Zach's arm. "Don't," she whispered fiercely, "not after everything." "Never planned to," Zach assured her, mind racing for a solution. The building adjacent to the saloon had a low roof, accessible from a stack of barrels in the alley, if they could reach it. A bullet splintered the doorframe inches from his head. They were out of time. "When I say run, head for those barrels," Zach instructed, gesturing with his chin. "I'll cover you." Lillian nodded, determination replacing fear in her eyes. Zach fired several shots in rapid succession, creating a moment of confusion. "Run." Lillian sprinted for the barrels, remarkably fast despite her skirts and the satchel. Zach followed, firing his remaining bullets to keep their attackers at bay. They scrambled up the barrels and onto the roof just as more gunfire peppered the alley below. "This way," Zach urged, leading her across the flat rooftop toward the next building. Behind them, flames from the saloon illuminated their escape, making them visible targets. Bullets whined overhead as they reached the far edge. The gap to the next roof was wider than Zach had hoped, at least 6 feet of open space with a 20-foot drop to the street below. "I can't jump that," Lillian said, eyes wide as she assessed the distance. "You won't have to," Zach replied, spotting a solution. A clothesline stretched between the buildings, anchored to a sturdy post on each roof. "We'll use that." Before she could protest, Zach removed his belt and looped it over the rope. Hold on to me, he instructed, tight as you can. Lillian secured the satchel crosswise over her body, then wrapped her arms around his waist. Zach could feel her trembling against him, but her grip was firm, ready. As I'll ever be, she whispered. Zach launched them off the edge, his belt sliding along the clothesline as they sailed over the gap. For one heart-stopping moment, they hung suspended between buildings, utterly exposed. Then they crashed onto the opposite roof, tumbling in a heap of limbs and dust. Are you hurt? Zach asked immediately, helping Lillian to her feet. She shook her head, breathless. Just bruised, I think. Behind them, shouts and gunfire continued. The men had seen their escape and were repositioning. Zach led Lillian across the second roof, finding a ladder that descended to a back courtyard. Where are we going? She asked as they climbed down. Stables, Zach replied. We need horses. They moved through shadows, avoiding the main street where Cornwall's men would be watching. The small settlement's livery stable was unguarded, its owner likely among those defending the saloon. Inside, Zach quickly selected 2 horses, saddling them with practiced efficiency while Lillian kept watch at the door. Someone's coming, she whispered urgently. Zach drew his revolver, only to realize he'd exhausted his ammunition during their escape. He grabbed a pitchfork instead, positioning himself beside the entrance. The door creaked open and a silhouette appeared. Before Zach could strike, Lillian gasped in recognition. Marshal Davis. The figure stepped fully into the stable, revealing a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A silver star gleamed on his chest in the lantern light. Miss West, the marshal replied, equally surprised. Joseph Whittaker telegraphed that you might be headed this way, but I never expected to find you in the middle of a gunfight. Relief flooded through Zach as he lowered the pitchfork. Cornwall's men found us on the trail. They're still out there. Not for long, Marshal Davis assured them. I brought 6 deputies with me. We've been tracking these particular hired guns for weeks. He nodded toward the satchel Lillian still clutched. I understand you have evidence against Richard Cornwall. My father's journal and financial records, Lillian confirmed, documenting years of opium smuggling and bribery. The marshal nodded gravely. That would explain why Cornwall's been willing to spend so much money and manpower to find you. He extended his hand. If you'll entrust it to me, I'll make sure it reaches the federal prosecutor in Denver. Lillian hesitated, looking to Zach for guidance. After 6 months of running, of trusting no one, surrendering the satchel to a stranger, even one with a badge, was no small matter. Marshal Davis is well known in these parts, Zach told her gently. If he says the evidence will reach Denver, it will. She nodded, slowly releasing her grip on the satchel. My father died for what's in here, she told the marshal. I need to know his sacrifice meant something. You have my word, Miss West, Davis replied solemnly. Cornwall will face justice for his crimes, all of them. Gunfire erupted outside, reminding them of the immediate danger. The marshal turned toward the door. Stay here until the shooting stops. You'll be safe enough in the stable. After he departed, Zach and Lillian waited in tense silence, listening as the gunfight intensified, then gradually subsided. When quiet finally returned, they ventured cautiously to the stable door. Outside, Marshal Davis and his deputies had Cornwall's men in custody, disarmed and bound for transport. The saloon fire had been contained, though smoke still rose from the damaged building. It's over, Zach said softly, feeling the weight of weeks, years of vigilance begin to lift from his shoulders. Lillian leaned against him, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. I can hardly believe it. Marshal Davis approached, the satchel secure under his arm. We'll be escorting these men to Helena for trial, he informed them. I'd like you both to follow in a few days to give your statements. Of course, Lillian agreed. Whatever is needed to ensure they're convicted. And Cornwall, Zach asked, will he be arrested? A federal warrant is being served in Boston as we speak, Davis assured them. By this time tomorrow, Richard Cornwall will be in custody. The realization that her long ordeal was truly ending brought tears to Lillian's eyes. Thank you, Marshal. Davis tipped his hat respectfully. Thank your father, Miss West. His courage may have cost him his life, but it will save countless others from the poison Cornwall has been bringing into this country. He turned to go, then paused. The Riverton Hotel should have rooms available. I suggest you both get some rest." After he departed, Zach and Lillian stood in the quiet street, the enormity of what had transpired settling around them. The immediate danger had passed. The evidence was in proper hands. For the first time in months, Lillian was truly safe. "What happens now?" she asked softly, looking up at Zach. He took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "First, we find that hotel room and get some sleep. Tomorrow, we send a telegram to the Whittakers letting them know we're safe. Then," he hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "What do you want to happen, Lillian?" She considered the question seriously. "I want to keep my promise to the Whittakers, finish teaching the children through the spring term at least." After that, her green eyes met his, vulnerable yet hopeful. "I suppose it depends on whether a certain cowboy plans to stay in one place long enough to build something permanent." Zach's heart swelled with emotions he'd denied himself for too long. "I think that cowboy might be ready to stop running," he said quietly, "if he had the right reason to stay." Lillian smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "Is that a promise, Zachary Holt?" He lifted her hand to his lips. "The most important one I've ever made." 3 months later, on a perfect summer evening, Zach stood on the porch of the small house he'd built on land adjacent to the Whittaker Ranch. From here he could see the golden wheat fields ripening in the valley, the mountains blue in the distance. The door opened behind him and Lillian emerged, a letter in her hand. No longer did she carry the battered satchel that had been her constant companion. Instead, she moved with the easy confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world. "News from Marshal Davis," she announced, joining him at the railing. "Cornwall has been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His entire smuggling operation has been dismantled." Zach slipped an arm around her waist. "Your father would be proud." "I think he would," she agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Though he might be scandalized by his daughter becoming a frontier wife." "Mrs. Lillian Holt," Zach murmured, still savoring the sound of their newly shared name. They had married 2 weeks earlier in a simple ceremony at the Whittaker Ranch, with Samuel officiating and the entire community in attendance. Lillian had continued teaching the Whittaker children, riding over each morning and returning each evening to the home she and Zach were building together. Come fall, she would open a proper schoolhouse in Timber Creek, fulfilling her dream of bringing education to the frontier. As for Zach, he had found his place as well. The skills that had once kept him alive as a drifter now served him well as a rancher. His small herd of cattle would grow in time, as would their homestead. For the first time in his adult life, he looked to the future with hope rather than wariness. "Any regrets?" he asked, watching the sunset paint the landscape in fiery hues. Lillian shook her head, smiling up at him. "Not one. Though I must admit, when I first arrived in Montana territory, I never imagined I'd find love alongside safety." "Nor did I," Zach admitted. "I thought the frontier was no place for love. That trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. And now," he turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Now I know that trusting you was the wisest decision I ever made, even when you made me promise not to open that mysterious satchel." Lillian laughed, the sound carrying across their land like a blessing. "The satchel that brought us together." "No," Zach corrected gently. "Courage brought us together, yours in carrying that burden alone for so long, mine in finally opening my heart when everything in me wanted to run." As the last light faded from the sky, they stood together on the porch of the home they'd built, no longer running, no longer afraid. The past with its dangers and sorrows would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined their future. That future stretched before them now, as vast and promising as the Montana sky, a future they would build together, one day at a time, on the foundation of trust and love they'd forged through trial and sacrifice. And in the quiet of the gathering twilight, Zach knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found what he'd been searching for all along, not just a place to belong, but a person to belong with. He had found home.